Today we're going to talk about butter and how to ramp up its flavour. And after today, you may just start using it on everything, even your coffee.
What are you doing with me?
More than that, we're going to be diving into the complex and fascinating chemistry of browning butter and the Maillard reaction, and how understanding that will help us to bottom out cooking and to help you cook better forever. For the butter, we're going to be turning it into something known as Beurre Noisette, which is the French name, and it kind of captures its aroma and its taste. And it goes so well with things from sweet to savoury, and it's so good that I think it will quickly become part of your go-to pantry. But before we get to that, the French, I'm sorry to say, have a problem. And this cuts because we English speakers faithfully use French terminology for things every day. So in this example, Beurre Noisette, we have crépinette, encroute, croquembouche. Here is a list of works of English culture that the French thought needed different titles. If These Walls Could Talk, a classic film with Demi Moore. What do you think that's called? Sex Revelations. No Strings Attached with Natalie Portman and Ashton Kutcher. Sex Friends. What's Your Number? A film with Anna Faris and Chris Evans. Sex List. Step Up. Great teen film. What do you think that's called? Sexy Dance. And finally, Cruel Intentions. Sexy Intentions. And yeah, they've spelled that one with an E. Why not? Now, how can you fix this feeling of intellectual and cultural disgust you're feeling? Well, I'll tell you. Like and subscribe to this channel. That was so overworked. Right, let's drag this video out of the gutter and onto the whiteboard. Now, butter is made from 3 principal components. We've got fats, and that's the majority of it. We've got proteins. Christ, look at that spelling. Key proteins and sugars. Now, when we see proteins and sugars, I want you to be thinking of one thing: the Maillard reaction. Now, this is distinctly different from caramelization, which just involves sugars. So if I ever see any of you ever again talking about caramelizing off your meat, we're gonna have a falling out. Sugar, protein, Maillard. Now we won't forget. Now, this is an energy diagram of a reaction, and you may remember this from your high school lectures. So we start with A and B, or in our case, a sugar and a protein. We apply heat, so we put energy into the system, and this is the increase in energy. And I was taught that you have a ball at the top of a hill, and once you get it there, it's going to roll down into the valley. And in our case, we end up with the glycosylamine and water. Now, this kind of 2D representation gets you pretty far, and in the chemistry that I was doing, I never really had to think about anything else because it's so controlled and you want such a specific reaction that it's only ever going to be a couple of things, and it's quite a linear system in a sense. But cooking isn't like that. Cooking's more wild, and you've got a vastly more complex pot of things. Like, there's so many chemicals and molecules in there that they're going to react in so many different ways. And how do you visualize that? Well, I think this Sony Bravia advert is actually pretty good. So initially, the balls can only roll straight down the hill. That's the first step. That's your A plus B goes to C plus D. But as they explore the landscape, which we can think of as chemical and flavor space, they bounce off in all sorts of directions, producing myriad flavor and aroma molecules. Now you have things like C plus A goes to E, and E plus D goes to H, and H plus H goes to G, etc., etc. You know, these molecules and these balls, as we're looking at them, bouncing off down the alleys and under people's cars, pooling against curbs, and while they're moving, you can consider them as being reactive. They're unstable. And the molecules you taste are the ones that have come to a stop, and they exist in energy wells and stable places where the balls come to rest, like against this curb and under cars. Now, this idea of a landscape and like balls falling down it is a really useful one for the complexity of cooking. And so when we're thinking about changing ingredients or changing the technique that we're using and changing the conditions, then what we're really doing is changing the landscape. We're changing where the balls can fall and where they can stop. When we add salt to a fermentation, for example, like, we're really changing the landscape, and we're changing the way in which that ball is going to fall down the hill. And by adding salt and holding it at room temperature, we've suddenly favoured lacto-fermentation, and we've created the conditions for the food to go in that direction. If we say heated it up, then you're going to get entirely different reactions, and suddenly you've killed off all the bacteria that were going to do the useful work for you, and that path is no longer available to you. So what do these paths look like for the Maillard reaction? To understand the first part of the Maillard reaction, and a great deal of chemistry to start with, you just need to know two things. Number one, when atoms join together in particular ways, they form what's called functional groups. And functional groups kind of make up the molecules. Now the second thing is that these functional groups react together in predictable ways, and to put it crudely, and to take this video straight back to the gutter, you can think of these as some being givers and some being takers. Now I'm talking about electrons, of course, and we'll look at how we can understand the first step of the Maillard reaction, and knowing just these two things will get you through a surprising number of degree-level sexy science papers.
Nice one, bro.
So for the Maillard reaction, we start with proteins and sugars, and through the process we end up developing flavour. And this is why Nathan Myod calls this, or says this should be called, the flavour reaction. And he's not wrong, and you really need to know about it because it's so foundational in cooking. So to go down a bit further, in the Maillard reaction we react proteins and sugars, and they look chemically like this. So this is an amino acid of a protein, and on one end you have the acid, and on the other end you have the amine, hence amino acid. And this R group is what changes between the 22 essential ones that you find in nature. And how these react depends on their structure, and actually they all give slightly different flavors once they go through this reaction. And the sugar has a lot of OH groups, a lot of alcohol groups, and crucially it has this aldehyde on the end. And if it has that, it's known as a reducing sugar, and this is what you need to perform the Maillard reaction at the first step. Now for these functional groups, oxygen really likes electrons, and anything that's attached to becomes deficient. And so here you have a slight positive charge. That is the taker. And for nitrogen, you have 2 electrons on the nitrogen, and this dislikes the electrons, so it kind of wants to give them away. And so this is delta negative, and you'll know that opposites attract, and the taker gives to the aldehyde. The first thing that you make in this reaction is a glycosylamine. Now this means that you create a bond where this red line is, so that would be here. And this reaction also produces water. It's a condensation reaction. It's called that because in these kind of reactions, chemists would notice that around the outside of the flask you're getting water form. And this is why it's important partly to have a low moisture content or a dry surface when you're trying to brown off food, because it's also possible to go in the other way. And if you have water being created here, then it can add back on and go back the other way. Whereas if it's dry and you don't have this, then it was more likely to go in the forward direction and it'll be quicker. The other reason, of course, is unless it's dry, you're not really going to get above 100 degrees because that's the boiling point of water. And boiling water takes a huge amount of energy. The amount of energy you need to go from 0 to 100 is only 1/5 of the amount of energy you need to take it from 100 and boil it off into steam to like 101 degrees, if you like, because you're changing phase. And so if you've got any water laying around, then it takes so much energy to get rid of it that you're going to end up cooking your meat before you start to colour. So it's really important to have it dry. So this is a more advanced stage of the Maillard reaction, and this is where we're starting to develop more of the flavour and aroma. Now, at some point we will have produced in this reaction a dicarbonyl. Now, you don't need to concern yourself with anything other than this is just another functional group, and it's an even better taker than the original aldehyde was on the sugar. And we're still going to react it with amino acids, which are still in the reaction. And so when we do this, we have condensed it down again. And this is again similar to what happened in the first step. But now the R group, remember these can be any kind of different carbon chains. These are what differentiate different amino acids, the 20 or so that you find in nature. And then in the next steps, you end up with an aldehyde. And aldehydes are the aroma molecules that we're familiar with. And this isn't necessarily the end point. I mean, once you've got this, it can react further. It will react further, as long as you're applying heat. Now, milk is characterized by having a high percentage of casein as the protein and lactose as the sugar, and this gives it some of its characteristic taste. So casein is high in something called proline, and lactose is a particular kind of sugar. And the high prevalence of casein and lactose in the original mixture is kind of going to stack the deck as to how this reaction is going to proceed, and then it means you're going to end up with a prevalence of certain aroma molecules and flavour molecules over the others. Now these are some of the key flavour aldehydes that you get from this Maillard reaction, and they derive from 4 different amino acids. So we have 2-methyl-butanal, and that comes from an amino acid called isoleucine. We have 3-methyl-butanal, which comes from leucine, We've got an aromatic one, which comes from phenylalanine. And then we also have methional, which comes from methionine. Now these aldehydes are incredibly important for flavour of many foods, and as it turns out, we're quite sensitive to them. And they are some of the more prominent notes that you'll find in chocolate, which of course has been roasted, in coffee, in bread, in beer, and when we're pan frying a steak. So the recipe we're going to make today is a sweet one, and we're going to be making brown butter cakes. And the reason we're going to do these is twofold. One is that they're just incredibly easy and delicious. There's not any skill really involved in it. You just have to brown up the butter, and we're going to do that with a bit of cardamom and a bit of thyme in, just to impart some of their flavour. And then you just mix it and bake it, and they're ready very quickly. And the second reason is that I can still remember the first time that I had these. Now the ones that we're going to make today are not an exact copy, but they are based off a recipe that Lyle's used in London, and they bake off these brown butter cakes to have as petit fours. And I just, the whole meal was incredible, but these came at the end, and it's what I remember most. I do have a bit of a sweet tooth, but I think once you make them, you'll understand why. Now the recipe's in the description below, but for now we've got the butter, and we're going to brown this off in a pan with green cardamom seeds and thyme. And for the sweetness, we've got some demerara sugar. It's quite soft, but you can use any brown sugar really. And the ground almonds, now these bring the bulk, if you like, to the cake, and also a bit of nuttiness and a bit of sweetness. And here we've got some egg whites that have just been separated off. And lastly, we've got gluten-free flour. So here's the important part. This is the brown butter. So we've got it gently melting, we've added the thyme and the cardamom to the pan. And as it melts and the water comes off, it starts to foam. And at this point, you'll notice that you'll start to see the brown milk solids come up from the bottom. This is what's starting to give the flavours. So we've got all these ingredients in a bowl, and all we need to do is whisk them together. Now I'm going to take out the thyme, but I will leave the cardamom in because I really like the flavour. So this is now cool, and we'll go into the mix. And then you just want to butter your moulds, and once you've done this part, pop it in the freezer. And then fill the moulds about 2/3 full. So you want to leave a bit of room for them to expand, and then we're going to put them in the oven at 180 degrees, a fan oven, for 20 to 25 minutes. So here it is, the first brown butter cake. Now they smell incredible, they smell rich, they smell sweet. It's definitely nutty, you can smell that brown butter, the cardamon's coming through, the thyme's coming through. They're crispy on the outside, soft on the inside. Very good. Now thank you for watching today, I hope you found that interesting. The recipe for the cakes is in the description below. Do go off and make those, they're an absolute winner. So like, subscribe and click the bell, and I'll see you next week.